when you mentioned advocacy, my thought was to the bill that you taught me about at the debate, John Lovick's bill, which is very exciting. What it's aiming to do to help fathers, and that's kind of what got me thinking about it. This discussion about custody and custodial rights. I'm hoping that bill will pass and would be a strong supporter of it.
Man, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
What do you say to, I'll use black men. About 50% of black men don't have any children. And so when you're taxing capital gains, what is the incentive? Why would I want to tax when I don't have any children and it's going into a child care fund? Why would I be on board for that?
Yeah. And I hear a lot of elderly voters as well say, why should I be voting for school bonds and levies? And my answer is children are our future. They are our investment. They are going to be our caretakers when we are elderly. They're going to be making laws that impact us. And I just firmly believe that we need to be investing in our future. It starts with our kids. All of the elderly people who don't have kids and who are not as interested in investing in kids, they were kids too, and they benefited from schools and an opportunity. And I think it is our moral imperative more than anything else is investing in our children, which is actually leads into the last plank of mine.
Well, let's jump into that. I
Yeah.
can buy the moral imperative, but I know that there's that can be a hard one for a lot of folks that, I don't have any children, or I'm looking at the way that youth are portrayed in social media and on the news right now, why they're accurate or exaggerated, right? And it's like, I don't want to support, the Kia boys or the Kia girls and all these, carjackings. And
well, when we're talking about childcare, we're talking about ages 0 through 5. And again, I mean, this is a core equity issue, equitable access to childcare. And women are still disproportionately the caretakers if there is a lack of childcare. When my son was 4 months old, I was getting ready to go back to work, and I was panicking because I was on a wait list that was over a year long, and it looked like I was going to have to decide, do I pause my legal career, or do I, to stay home with my son, or and actually there was no alternative. That's what I was going to have to do. And at the 11th hour, I was able to get in a childcare slot.
Let's quickly switch to that.
Sure.
So I went through a divorce several years ago, and you have to go through a class here in Washington. And so I took this class, I think it was in Silverdale, and it was a woman and a man teaching the class. And we sat down, and the first thing they said is, well, all the men in this room, we just want to apologize to you because you're screwed. And being a non-custodial parent, we are not afforded many of the rights as the custodial parent, right? It isn't typically an automatic 50-50. And so what you see is men, especially black men, are negatively impacted because they're not going to have the qualification for food assistance or housing the way that the custodial parent, which is typically a woman, has, right? One of the issues that I see that I wish would change is that it would automatically be 50-50. And that if one party is eligible for food assistance and housing assistance, then the other parent is also. Because what it does is it kind of pits the parents against each other from a financial aspect. So here the custodial parent has TANF, has a housing voucher, has food assistance, has childcare, but then the non-custodial parent, when they have the child, doesn't have access to those things, right? And so they don't have the resources, but oftentimes are just as impoverished or worse because now they are required to pay child support, right? And so when you're looking at, okay, your support enforcement is $500 a month. But if I'm low income and I'm working an hourly wage job, 1 or 2, and we're saying here, we've been talking this whole time, not today, but just in general, right? Society has been talking about how much housing is unaffordable, transportation and everything else, then that $500 that is also going out, I can't make my $1,500 rent myself. And then I'm required to do this at the same time. And typically what's told the men is, well, you should have wrapped it up. You should know, you should have thought about that before you get the kid. But then the custodial parent, which is typically a woman, has those supports in there. So my thought on that would be, if there is a child, then it is automatically 50-50 and both parents have access instead of pitting them against each other from a financial standpoint. Just get your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think we should always be looking at what is in the best interests of the child, because every situation is going to be very different. Families are going to be different. I think, just kind of circling back.
I want to cut you off just for a second. We typically know from statistics that the best interest of the child is to be raised in a two-parent household.
Yes, but I mean, if we're talking about a situation where, and this happens in dependencies, where the lens is what is in the best interests of the child as well. And there's an advocate, the court-appointed special advocate, whose sole job is to look at what is in the best interest. So if we're talking about a custody issue, and I do want to insert, when we're talking about also access to justice, we've recently in the past couple of years created a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. I would like to see a right to counsel when it comes to child custody, because too often the person that gets the child is the person that has representation, which is the person that has more financial resources. And child custody disputes should not be based off of who has more money to get a better lawyer.
I don't know. Is that true? I don't know if that's true. Because it seems like still, like even with wealthy families, typically the woman will get custody of the child. I think of NBA players and NFL players, right? And they're paying millions of dollars in child support, and to the tune of, we hear crazy stuff like $14,000 to $20,000 a month to the mother, right? And it's like, well, if that person is more financially stable, then you would think that child custody would stay with the financially strong person, but it actually is given to the person that's not financially strong. So I just want to push back on that, because I don't actually see that.
Well, and I think, but when we're looking at higher profile people, child custody is such, and those determinations are so different state to state. So I think we would need to also look at, what is the Washington, and now I'm curious and want to look it up, right? Like, what is the Washington experience versus the Alabama or California experience in terms of how those determinations are made? Because it is very different state to state and how that happens as well. But I would go back to childcare access. Oftentimes, the primary caretaker has to decide, am I making enough to justify paying a high cost for childcare? We know it's driving people out of the workforce, because oftentimes the money shakes out that it's cheaper to have someone at home than to go into the workforce. So that's another reason we're going to have more people participating in our workforce if we have childcare access, which goes back to why we need to keep the capital gains tax in place. And then moving over to the CARES Act, while I had concerns about how it was implemented, the idea, I think, is important. We need to start planning for long-term care, something that might take someone, a disability or an unexpected illness, to be able to have a safety net resource so that we can help people in that time of need. And that's what the WA Cares Fund is for, to be able to provide, in-home care services. And there is a monetary cap. I think right now it's a $36,000 lifetime cap. And anybody who's helped an elderly parent or knows how quickly that money disappears. But also it can be a bridge for people who just need short-term support as well. And so it's, I've read that it's our first in the nation long-term care program.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's, we need to continue investing in that.
Yeah, I think it's, I would love to see what you were saying, to have that representation for the non-custodial parent. But if who did you say is the one that determines what's the best interest of the child.
So I'm kind of conflating two separate things. So the best interest of the child is the framework in a dependency case, a court-appointed special advocate. Their sole job is to look through that lens, which can then, they could either side with the state or they could side with the family.
But historically, they don't, right? Because if they're looking at what's in the best interest of the child, in a typical sense, you have two people that have come together to have a child, right? Statistically, kids do better in a two-parent household. This household is now broken up, right? So then they should have equal time with both. We don't do that. What we say is we set a primary care provider, and then that person is eligible for all the resources, and this one becomes a payee into that system. And typically that payee, which is the man, is harmed by that, right? Because they're not, again, like I was saying, they don't have access to those resources that she has, or to the custodial parent, because it does happen the other way, just not near the percentages, right? So if we start off with the level playing field and say, hey, we know that a parent needs equal time with the mother and the father, right? And this determination happens, and I've been working in social services for about 20-some years, right? And you'll see where you have mothers who are suffering from addiction, criminal history, and other things, and they're still trying to get the child back to the parent. And you have dad over here that's just struggling and just trying to make it every day, and the priority is still there, right? And so we see it, and men have remained silent, because we're ostracized and we're told, well, you know what, suck it up, just deal with it, be a man. Again, well, you shouldn't have, had a kid with this person. That's your problem. Now you got to deal with it. That's your responsibility. The kids, right? The moral argument. And so we have all these things that are pitted against us, and then there's no advocacy for it, and then it just kind of is the status quo. Now, I am happy to report that things have been slowly changing in Olympia, where you're starting to see more of, and I think nationwide too, where you're starting to see a little bit more balance. I just don't think that pendulum is swinging fast enough to the middle, because the situation really does still hurt the child, right? And if we look at some of those statistics, I believe it's two-parent households, kids do the best. And then I believe it's male households, the child does best. And then from there on, right? But we ignore those statistics that are there, and then we do just the opposite. So I would just like to see, like you said, that representation would be big. And from a lawyer standpoint, I would love for you to advocate in that way, and make that an even playing field. Because as I said before, I think ultimately that you want both parents to thrive so the child can thrive.
Well, and I think when you mentioned advocacy, my thought was to the bill that you taught me about at the debate, John Lovick's bill, which is very exciting, supporting young men and
boys.
I was reading,
boys,
yes, and I was reading just a little bit about it. And it was really exciting to see that it has such strong bipartisan support. What it's aiming to do to help fathers, and that's kind of what got me thinking about it. This discussion about custody and custodial rights. Hopefully, I'm hoping that bill will pass and would be a strong supporter of it.
Man, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a big deal.